Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Word Balloon. Welcome to 2020. This is John Suntress. 2020 is Word Balloon's 15th year. Come May 10th, it will be Word Balloon's 15th anniversary officially. And I will be representing a bunch of great episodes from the Word Balloon archives leading up to May 10th. So I hope you'll enjoy those. Thanks a lot for listening today. Questions or comments about the show, reach me via email, john@wordballoon.com. You can follow me on Twitter under John Wordballoon, @JohnWordballoon, or under Facebook under my name, John Suntress, and, of course, the Word Balloon Network. So, great month. Really looking forward to what's going to happen this month in January. I thank you for being along on the ride. You might hear one more commercial before the show starts. Please listen to the commercials. Don't fast forward them. That's how I get paid. And I thank you for your support and your attention. One more spot, and then the show will begin. Thanks a lot for listening. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Matt, great conversation today with Matt Singer, the New York Critic. I'm a big fan, have been for years. Matt used to have an excellent podcast where he would look at streaming movies in particular, but he reviews all kinds of movies and television. We just had him on a couple of months ago to talk about his wonderful Spider-Man history book that he put out. But now I wanted to talk to him because, it was the beginning of the new year. I wanted to review 2019, also take a look at what's coming up in 2020. It's certainly awards season. The Oscar nominations are being announced today, and with that, I figured it'd be fun to give a rundown of some of the award-worthy movies that I've had the pleasure of seeing and having a chance to watch. I hope you don't think I'm bragging. It was really this accident. I had to join the radio union, and the Radio and Television Union, AFTRA, merged with the Screen Actors Guild. And as a byproduct of that, I get these screeners and get to vote on the SAG Awards. It's amazing. I can't believe it myself. And it gives me the opportunity to watch a lot of award season films, and they're sent to me, which is great, both digitally, and I also get DVDs, which is pretty amazing. And it's a blast every year. This is my third year doing it, and it's a lot of fun. So, it's always good to get a critic's point of view on movies. I had Rob Burnett on a couple days ago, and I asked him about some of these movies as well. But we also talk about TV and streaming and what's going on, and the future for a lot of these channels, and some of these films as well. Matt Singer on today's Word Balloon. All brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you very much, League, for your great support via Patreon. As I always say, Word Balloon is free. It'll always be free, but if you want to help out the cause and you like what I do here, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon. Thanks, as always, for your great support, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon also sponsored by Aftershock Comics, shaking things up at your local shop this year with new upcoming titles. John Layman's The Man Who Effed Up Time, Zach Thompson's Undone by Blood, and God Killers by Mark Sable. Those titles will go along with favorites like Animosity from Marguerite Bennett and Raphael De La Tour, and Baby Teeth with Donnie Cates and Gary Brown, A Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Gordon Sudzuka. Their catalog is filled with some of my favorite people: Paul Jenkins, Tim Seeley, Cullen Bunn, Brian Azzarello, Jim Starlin, so many more. If you go to their website, you're going to find great books and great ideas. They have full story descriptions, preview pages, and the diamond codes on how to order these books through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. All right, let's get into it now. A conversation with Matt Singer about a lot of geek movies and both 2019 wrap-up and a look ahead to 2020 on today's Word Balloon. It has been years, and I'm embarrassed to say that, but Matt Singer, welcome back to Word Balloon. I'm happy to have you back, man.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Everything's going good at Screen Crush?
Yes.
Excellent.
We're still here, so that's I guess that's good.
Excellent to hear. Are you doing a podcast still?
I'm not doing I'm doing your podcast right now.
Well, you know what I mean.
I ceased my podcast, I guess about a year and a half ago or so. But I've had a few ideas. I'm sure that won't be my last ever podcast. But at the moment, yours is the only podcast I'm appearing on.
Well, thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. Congratulations on this book, an exploration of Spider-Man through his art.
Yes,
and interviewing a lot of artists and writers about the character, and that's certainly some of the usual suspects in the best way, because I think Spider-Man has had an interesting array of creators, especially in the last 20 years or so. But some of the old-timers are in there as well, or at least relatively speaking, old-timers. Tell me what intrigued you about doing a Spider-Man book.
Well, for me, Spider-Man is the comic book character. I've loved comics my whole life, certainly, but I mean the character that I first fell in love with and have always loved the most is Spider-Man. So if you said to me you could write a book on any subject, something like this would absolutely be very close to the top of the list. And certainly if it was anything about comics, this is the one that I would want to write about. So it's I've said in other interviews, is like, this is, I didn't have a long time to write the book once we actually started officially working on it, but I've had like 38 years of research to draw on just from reading Spider-Man comics, watching Spider-Man movies and cartoons, and on down the line. So it definitely was a bit of a dream come true for me to get to kind of channel all of that love into a book.
That's cool. I wonder, and I want to get into the book, but also I'm curious if you feel that with every movie we get a couple million more Spider-Man fans, and obviously there's a difference between movie Spider-Man and comic book Spider-Man, and I wonder if you've noticed how the character has changed from a screen standpoint. I mean, really, this seems to be in Tom Holland the youngest Spider-Man out there, and I like him. I like him as Spider-Man a lot, but he really is year one Spider-Man compared to, even Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man seemed a little older, and certainly comic book Spider-Man is certainly more of a superhero veteran than what we're getting in the film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, I think, the thing that distinguishes the Tom Holland Spider-Man is that, even through two movies, I think he's probably at least, character age-wise younger than any of the other ones were at the same point in their franchises. I'm pretty sure Tobey Maguire wasn't even in high school by the end of that first movie. I think he graduates from high school pretty early on in that film. So that is something that definitely distinguishes the Tom Holland character. And one of the things that I liked about the two movies with him so far is that, they were very insistent in all of the, the promotion, the interviews, the hype for especially the first movie. They're like, well, we're not doing another origin story. We're not making the origin of Spider-Man. We already did that 2 different times with 2 different Spider-Man. This is different. This is a different kind of Spider-Man story. And they certainly don't have Uncle Ben. They don't have him getting bitten by a spider. But one of the things that I kind of liked, especially after seeing the second one and kind of rewatching the first and looking them together, is like it's almost like they're telling like a very kind of subtle, oblique, long-form origin of Spider-Man. Like he's Spider-Man. He's got the costume. He's got the powers. He's got all that stuff. But he hasn't quite learned with great power comes great responsibility all the time yet. He's never said it. He's certainly heroic. He does heroic things, but he stumbles sometimes. He's very fixated on Mary Jane, or he doesn't, he's very interested in being maybe taking on more than he's really ready for, and so I feel like the movies, those current Tom Holland ones, are kind of like building to the moment where he kind of has that moment, maybe in the third film, maybe in another film, who knows? But I don't know. There's something about it, the way that they've utilized his youth to kind of play up that side of the character. I've found pretty fun and interesting. And of course, there's also the Spider-Verse movie as well, which we just had and was terrific as well.
That's its own animal, and I really liked it because it obviously really exploiting the idea of different Spider-Men to the nth degree, obviously. But I really did appreciate the ideas that Spider-Verse, gave us that are very different from the Marvel movies or the Sony movies even, and I think that's cool. And I think it shows the flexibility of the interpretation of the characters. I'm sure you feel the same way. And yeah, oh my God, perfect cartoon. I mean, God, I can't think of one thing about it that I don't like.
No, and I'm a member of the New York Film Critics Circle, and I was quite pleased that last year at our awards we gave it Best Animated Feature, and we were definitely one of the first critics groups to do that. As you might expect, given that I've now written a book on Spider-Man, I feel pretty strongly about the character in general. But I thought that was probably the best movie ever, Spider-Man wise, and an outstanding animated movie. The more you see about the technical side of it, even the craft that went into animating it in certain ways to give each different Spider-Man a slightly different, not only physical appearance, but the way they move, the way that they're animated. They put so much thought and care into it. I thought it was a very deserving Best Animated Feature last year, and then when it went on to win the Oscar, I thought that was fantastic, and I was really excited that happened. In fact,
yeah, pretty cool, man. I completely agree. Well, first of all, Insight Editions is the publisher. Is that an independent publisher? Are you self-publishing? What's going on here?
Insight Editions is I think they're based out of San Francisco. They're a California company, okay. And they're affiliated with one of the bigger publishers. I think maybe Simon and Schuster, and they really specialize in pop culture books. They have a comics imprint as well, but they do a lot of really cool licensed stuff. They have tons of Star Wars books and Harry Potter books and Marvel Comics books. So it's a lot of really cool stuff like this that's kind of licensed, and histories and art books. If you pick up my book and you like it, there are several other books. It's not an official series, but they all have they're the same size. You could display them all together. They're these beautiful, oversized art books, and I know that they've done one for Guardians of the Galaxy and Black Panther and Black Widow. So, this is, they definitely do a bunch of stuff like this with Marvel. Did
they find you, or how did you hook up with them for this project?
So for this project, I had worked for Insight on a previous thing. I contributed a couple of essays to a really cool anthology book that was connected to the I don't know if you saw this AMC miniseries. Is called, I think, James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. It was the history of sci-fi movies and television shows. And James Cameron was he was the producer. He was not really the host, but he interviewed all of these very famous filmmakers in the show, like George Lucas and Spielberg and Guillermo del Toro and Ridley Scott, Christopher Nolan, a whole bunch of really famous people.
Sure.
And they cut all that together with a lot of interviews with talking heads, actors, other filmmakers, and some critics and historians and stuff. And so I was in the series as kind of a talking head occasionally, and because I did that, Insight Editions reached out to me and said, we're making a companion book for the series. Would you want to write an essay for the book? So I did, and that I ended up actually doing 2 essays in that book, which is a really cool book too. If you like science fiction, if you like James Cameron, it's got essays, and it also has all of the interviews that Cameron did in the show. They have basically transcriptions of the interviews with Spielberg and Lucas and all of those guys. So I did that, and then I reached out to them because I wanted to I wanted to write a book. I've been dying to do that for a long time, and nothing's ever kind of come together. And I reached out to the editor there that I had worked with and said, you have any, I have some ideas I could pitch you, but do you have any projects, that you need someone for? And the editor I spoke to said, well, I don't have anything, but by any chance, do you like Spider-Man? Which was
you like chocolate?
I think the reaction I had was "Auga" or something like that, So, and that was it. Then I had to sort of, convince the editor on the book Holly Fisher to I kind of had to sell her on me, and then I had to Marvel it's a licensed book. Marvel had to approve it, so
sure.
I had to go through that process, and that was it. And then I had to write the book.
Well, it's always good, especially for an art book, to certainly be authorized by whatever the licensed property is you're doing, because this book takes great advantage of that, and you're able to present some great moments of Spider-Man from an artistic standpoint. You're talking to all the top people, and as well, there have been some wonderful unauthorized essay collections and even just one author exploring a subject without getting the green light. I mean, God, Bob Greenberger just did a great Star Trek thing a couple of years ago about the entire milieu of Star Trek up to the JJ movies, and I thought it was a really great book, but he certainly didn't do it with Paramount's blessing or CBS's blessing, for that matter. But in this case, you are able to, and again, as an art book and stuff, I mean, these are some of the great moments of Spider-Man from all the great artists going back to Ditko, and all the wonderful people like the Bagleys and the like that have graced the character in these many years, and also the great writers as well. I know a lot of these guys already, and you have Jan DeMatteis doing your foreword and everything. I mean, this is a nice grouping of Spider-Man people. And certainly, again, it's a tremendous art book. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and I should say, in terms of Marvel, there wasn't a lot of in terms of they have to approve it, or we don't want vetting, or we don't want to they're going to be very sensitive, or I don't know. Maybe you hear that and you think, well, they're not going to let me write certain things or say certain things. Like the process of after the book was done, we had to get it approved by Marvel, and the changes were so minimal. I was actually kind of very happy and surprised. They it wasn't well, you can't talk about the Clone Saga, or maybe don't be so critical of this or that. And it's not like I'm sitting there bashing these comics, but I think we talked pretty honestly about the whole history of the character, and there was very few take this out, you can't do this. There really wasn't anything, frankly. And I mean, we picked and we picked all the artwork, and we had basically the entire history of Marvel Spider-Man artwork to choose from, to include, and there really wasn't a lot of restrictions on what we could do, other than it is specifically, we've already talked about the movies, and I love the movies, but it is specifically about the comics. This isn't the history of Spider-Man movies or Spider-Man video games or the ancillary stuff. I would love to write that book. If someone wants me to write that book, I would be very happy to do it. But this is expressly about the comics, which is great for me because I love the comics. But I feel like I'm trying to think some of the notes that I got back, and really one of the few big ones was we really want more Spider-Verse and more Miles Morales, which is great for me. I was happy to do that. I just it was more I think when I first kind of conceived of the structure and stuff, I felt like they might want it to be more Peter Parker focused, and certainly his history and the history of his comics is the main part of the book. But we have a last chapter that's all kind of, it's like a Spider-Verse chapter basically, and so there's a ton about Miles and Spider-Gwen, and pretty much that chapter is where you're going to find all the alternate versions of the character, or the kind of other Spider heroes that have existed, dating back to the original Spider-Woman. So, it was actually, I was really pleased with how it all went. And I mean, the only complaint I have about this book is I could have written one twice as long. I think I'm so happy with how it came out. I think it's a great book. I mean, I should hope so since I wrote it, but it wasn't an experience where I can tell I was frustrated, or I didn't get to say this, or I didn't get to say that. The only thing I didn't get to say was the stuff that I had to kind of cut out to make it all fit in. But I think it's a pretty good overview of the 57-ish years of Spider-Man history so far.
Yikes! I'm always scared when I hear a number like that compared to my birthday, and I'm I'm still younger than Spider-Man, barely. by 2 or 3 years, but yeah, barely. So that's cool. And as you say in the last chapter, you get to kind of explore some of the more current iterations. Spider-Gwen's certainly a new phenomenon, relatively speaking, only a couple years or so. Who is the most modern Spider-Man writer or artist that you spoke to in the book?
Well, because the writing of the book was done at the end of last year,
sure.
For the most part. So it kind of, and because of just how things turned out and who was available to talk to me and stuff, it kind of made a lot of sense to sort of wrap it up with the kind of the end of, besides Spider-Verse, like the end of the Dan Slott run.
Okay,
so that's sort
sure.
of like the, I think it's Amazing 801 was his last issue.
Yeah.
So there's actually quite a bit of that, which I thought was an incredible issue. Actually,
how many years? I mean, my God, and how many hundreds of Spider? I mean, we were all amazed when Brian Bendis, beat Stan Lee as far as writing so many Spider-Man stories and stuff like that, and then Dan is like a Mack truck that just trashed that record, and I mean, add literally a couple hundred more. I don't even know what the count is for Dan's run.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. But so that's sort of the cutoff is the end of Dan Slott's run.
Okay.
And I spoke to him, and I don't even know how many hours that interview was. He was incredible. I wish I could have included the whole the whole interview somewhere, because it's pretty great.
Well, next book,
yeah, right, yeah. But yeah, so that's sort of the most current stuff.
Okay,
that's in there. There may be a couple of, in that last Spider-Verse chapter, there may be one or two things that were published after Amazing 801, but just for sake of when I was writing it and the deadline and all of that, that's sort of where we cut it off.
Gotcha. And yeah, man, I know you hit all the interesting eras and stuff, and I mean the obvious ones of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and you're talking to and I always lean on the writers, you'll forgive me, but the Stearns and the DeFalcos and the Bendises obviously, and I mean, who are the earliest creators that you were able to talk to?
Well, I did talk to all the people you just mentioned. Those are later ones, but I
Sure.
did speak to all of those. But I guess it would be Roy Thomas, who was the first writer after Stan Lee to write Amazing Spider-Man. Stan passed away not that long after I got the job writing this book, actually, very unfortunately. Like, it might have even been, I'd have to look at the timeline, but it might have been even like less than a month before. So, unfortunately, that couldn't happen. But I talked to Roy Thomas, and I talked for a very long time with Jerry Conway as well.
Excellent. Love Jerry. And honestly, man, there's your first post-Stan Spider-Man writer that blew my mind with the death of Gwen Stacy and everything. And I always tell him that I was 9, and I didn't read the original. I read the Marvel Tales reprint, which wasn't that long after the original had run. It was only a couple of years. But yeah, I was 9 years old, and I always tell him he blew my mind in the best possible way, because, it's like, wow, stories can have consequences, and it didn't turn me into a killer, or I didn't go postal after reading it, but it really was like, wait a minute, she died. What the hell just happened? Oh my God. And that art and everything, the Gil Kane and, and you correct me if I'm wrong, was it Gil Kane and also, Esposito and shame, I'm blanking right now on the great artist. You tell me.
Well, it was Gil Kane. I'm pretty sure it was Gil Kane, and it was, Romita was doing layouts, and Gil Kane was drawing the book at that time.
Got it. And I'm trying to remember who it was. Mike Esposito and.
Are you thinking of Ross Andrew?
I am thinking of Ross Andrew. I was going to say that one of the classic Spider-Man artists that are never in the conversation of being classic Spider-Man artists, and it's like never discount Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito. Mike was the inker on that.
Right.
They were an amazing team, and very very similar in the style of not only Gil Kane but Sal Buscema. There was all those guys kind of had very similar styles. I think at that period of the 70s. When I don't even know if actually how much Sal drew Spider-Man for that matter.
Sal drew a ton of Spider-Man. I mean, he drew Spectacular Spider-Man for a stretch, and roughly around that period, a little bit after that period, and then of course he came back and he did a very long run again on Spectacular Spider-Man when I was a kid, when I was reading it, like through the Clone Saga and past that, that he did a really great run. Some of that might have been with Jerry Conway again when he came back to Spider-Man around that period. Okay. But then there was also a lot of, pretty sure there's a lot of J.M. DeMatteis issues in there as well, including like the stuff with when Harry becomes the Goblin again. I'm pretty sure he'd been the Green Goblin before. That kept happening. It was a recurring motif. But some of the famous stuff where I think like Spectacular number 200 and all that. All of these artists are definitely featured in the book. I talked to Jerry Conway about working with Ross Andru, and I talked to a bunch of people about Sal Buscema because he did work with so many different writers, and there's plenty of there's his artwork is in there as well. I did my best to because obviously you have to include so much of those really the famous the iconic.
Oh sure, Ditko and Romita Senior, certainly.
Right, of course. But you also, I also did my best to kind of, to try to get as much of the Buscemas, the Ross Andrews, there's a lot of them. But it's 57 years in about 200 pages, oversized pages. But I did my best to include as much of the best stuff as I could.
Well, where are you on the Clone Saga in terms of yay or nay? I have to confess. It is one of the things that pushed me away from comics for a period in the 90s. I mean, and it wasn't as much the story as it was all the gimmicks of the 90s, the foil covers and the holograms, and treating comic books like baseball cards. And It's like, this is great, but where's the fucking story? And I mean, I loved, McFarlane obviously was a revelation, and, Eric Larson and some of the other greats that came from that period. But I'm just like, all right, help me out with the story. What's going on with the story? So I checked out. I have to admit, were you a Clone Saga fan?
Well, it's funny because that period you're talking about is really when I became kind of obsessively reading the comics. Okay. Not necessarily because I wanted a chromium holographic cover or any of that, but that was what was in vogue at the time. Sure. And in fact, the first issue that I had a scattered Spider-Man comics all through my childhood, but the issue that really kind of set me off collecting was Amazing Spider-Man 365, which was like the 30th anniversary issue and had a big goofy hologram in the center of the cover, which when I was 12 years old, that was like, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen, So, I was a little younger than you when those were coming out.
You were the right age, man. They were speaking to you, absolutely.
Right. So I kept reading through all of that stuff. I mean, when you go back and reread it now, which I did as part of the research for the book, it has a let's say a less than sparkling reputation. But I think when you go back and look at it, I think what you see is an actually a really interesting idea that kind of, in a way, was sort of the victim of its own success. Yes. I actually, for the book, I talked to Tom DeFalco, I talked to Danny Fingeroth, I talked to J.M. DeMatteis, I talked to a bunch of people and we talked about this part of Spider-Man. It's a pretty important big part, so you kind of can't ignore it. So I think what you hear from those guys when you talk to them about it is that basically this is a period where, your story is not unique in terms of being driven away from comics. Even though all those holograms and chromium covers and die-cut covers and all that jazz was selling a lot of copies, that was also a period where, for Marvel, Marvel wasn't doing all that well.
Oh, it wasn't.
And I know it's for younger listeners to even imagine, but Marvel was bankrupt. Marvel almost ceased to exist in the form that it was in at the time. It's very unbelievable to conceive now that Marvel is the biggest entertainment brand in the world, but this was a very dark time for the company, and the initial Clone Saga books sold really well. It was one of the things that for Marvel was actually, from a sales perspective, was really working. So basically, they had an original plan, an original timeline that was, I don't know, something like 6 months or a year for the whole thing. And when the book started selling, the marketing people were like, you can't stop.
It. Right.
You have to keep going.
Yes.
And they're like, oh, okay. And so when you're reading those books, that feels like they just never end, there's no ending, or they will come to a conclusion and then the story just keeps going anyway. That's because that's what was happening behind the scenes. They were coming up with endings, but then they would have to prolong it. They would have to keep they would have to extend it in this way or that way. So I think that is really where the book started to, or the series, the storyline really started to slip. But I think in the first, issues, couple of stories, and in the kind of general concept, there's something to it. I think that I think it touches on a elemental idea of Spider-Man. I'm looking in the book right now. I'm looking at my my copy of it, and there's the cover of Web of Spider-Man 117, which is the very first issue where the clone, where Ben Reilly comes back, and the cover is Spider-Man versus it's a picture of Spider-Man fighting Peter Parker. Now we know now that that's the clone, that's Ben Reilly, but it says Spider-Man versus Peter Parker ? Exclamation point on the cover. And that idea of Spider-Man and Peter Parker kind of ruining each other's lives even though they're the same person, that's one of the most fundamental ideas of Spider-Man. That's what every Spider-Man story is Peter Parker wants to go out on a date with Mary Jane, but Dr. Octopus is blowing up something, right? His laboratory. Or, every single great kind of Spider-Man storyline is about that conflict.
100%, man.
And so, there's something kind of interesting about the idea of, because at the time, Spider-Man and the real Spider-Man, the real Peter Parker was very dark and brooding. He had all this stuff had been going on in the comics with his parents came back and then they died, and they were it was all a chameleon plot, and I sound insane when I'm describing it, but that was what was happening. And so he wasn't very, let's say, Peter Parker-y.
Stable.
He wasn't wisecracking. He wasn't him. He was much more spider than man, right? That was the idea.
Sure.
And so bring in this physical Peter Parker to fight with him, who is more optimistic and, it seems more like the Peter Parker of old. That's interesting. There's interesting stuff to explore there. Now, 2 years later, when they were still doing it, is there much left to explore? Maybe not. But I think overall there is some good stuff in there if you want to go back and check them out.
I understand that, and truly, God, I again through Marvel Tales remember reading that original Clone Saga of the Jackal and the creation. I remember the What If story that kind of presaged the Clone Saga and had the clone kind of accidentally put real Peter on ice. And he continued his life not realizing that he was the clone, and he was slightly younger, and man, my clothes don't fit. I mean, literally, innocuous things like that. And I agree with you in terms of the general theme of the Clone Saga, going back to, Stan and Ditko and Ramita when, Spider-Man had the flu. And May, thinking she's doing the right thing, gave him some cold medicine and stuff, and he's literally, fighting through NyQuil, trying to fight the lizard or whoever he was fighting at the moment. Or those great scenes of him at the laundromat washing his costume but wearing his mask and wearing a trench coat or whatever. And it's just, the biggest problem in Spider-Man's life was paying the bills and being Peter Parker and stuff. It's interesting. I just spoke to Brian Bendis about abandoning the Clark Kent identity of Superman. And obviously, it's an echo of what they played with during Civil War, and I know that's one of the key moments in your book as well, as the unmasking and everything. How do you think they handled that? I always feel like they cut it off too short and really didn't explore a lot of the things that was part of the promise of the unmasking. When you had all that great sequence of him giving his speech, and you cut around the Marvel Universe, and you had reactions from Flash Thompson to Doc Ock to friends, family, enemies, other heroes, certainly J. Jonah and everybody, and it's like, wow, what the hell's going on here? What will this lead to? And we got a couple glimpses of great moments, but I always felt like they should have let it continue longer, and we should have gotten more.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, that I think that was such a bold and interesting idea, and I mean, like, that's one of those comics where I vividly remember where I was when I read it.
Yes.
It was such a mind-blowing thing. Like,
yes.
I was sitting in like a Jamba Juice in Midtown. I had just come from like Midtown Comics or wherever I had gotten the actual issue, and then walked over to this place, and I remember wanting to read it just because I was, it was a big storyline at the time, and so reading it and then being like, what? Like, I guess I hadn't heard. I don't know if it was a known thing that it was going to happen. Maybe I don't keep up with comics news as much as I should, but I remember just sitting there and just jaw on the table in front of me and reading it and rereading it a couple of times in a row and just being like, they did not, and of course I'm not so naive that I don't think that they could undo it eventually, but still it was like such a huge thing to do. And then a lot of the books that followed, I mean, it was all the stuff, it was much more like, it was very plot driven. It was all the stuff with Civil War, which was,
yes.
it was a good story, it was a good series, but, Peter Parker was a very small part of that. And then after that, they went right into the stuff where, I think, Aunt May is shot and
yep.
it's Peter's fault, or he believes it's his fault, and so he's trying to save her, which led right into the, the whole One More Day storyline.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of agree with you. I would have loved to have seen, a couple of years or more, at least more of like what it was like for him in a world where everyone knew he was Spider-Man, where it wasn't just about these, so heavy on all of these bigger storylines and plots. Because to me, so much of the best Spider-Man stories are about Peter and about the character as much as they are about, the action and the fighting and that's always certainly important. I don't think we really got to feel what that was like entirely, or at least I agree that there was probably more they could have done there. I talked to Mark Miller about that, that reveal, because
yes.
he wrote Civil War.
Absolutely.
And he said basically, like, the thing that he claimed he hadn't really talked about before, talking to me, was like basically that his editor on those books, which I think was Tom Brevoort, was like, let's as part of the Civil War, let's reveal Peter Parker's identity, because, well, we know that we're at this date, X date, right down the line, we're going to do One More Day. They knew already they were going to reset everything.
Back. Interesting, yes.
So I guess it gave them a little bit more carte blanche to kind of do whatever they wanted to kind of mess with Spider-Man, because they knew already at that point, well, in X amount of months, we're going to go back to kind of a square one situation and do the Brand New Day continuity. Yep. So, it was always planned to be very short term, which is probably not that surprising. But I guess that does speak to the fact that there really wasn't a ton of time to fully play out that idea. And maybe someday they'll do more with it or something like it. It certainly seems possible to me.
Sure. Well, to every generation, there's another opportunity to readdress a theme like that. In the Civil War period, Straczynski's run has its hits and misses, but I really felt in Civil War in particular, and when he released his book this summer, I got to talk to him at length, and I always tell him my favorite Spider-Man, two of my favorite Spider-Man moments of his was the gift that Doctor Strange gives him, and I think it was 500, where he's able to talk to Uncle Ben, and Uncle Ben's able to say, "Hey, I'm proud of you. You're doing it right." And that was amazing. And I'm even slightly choking up even saying it right now, because it really did. It hit me, man. But even another great moment in Civil War, when Tony Stark finally convinces him to go to his way. And it's so funny. And again, it's so different in the film, because Spider-Man is a much more established veteran hero. but still has that mentorship relationship with Tony that only started developing more in Civil War. And he says, you know something, Tony, you're smarter than me. And it's so classically Peter. And he's like, every fiber of my being and my spider sense is telling me this is the wrong decision. But you're smarter than me, so I'm going with you. If I'm wrong, I'm coming after you. And it was so great to see. Those are my favorite moments. And another later when the Kingpin makes the hit on Aunt May. And you got Peter going to the cell block, and Peter is going to the cell block looking for the Kingpin, and he beats the shit out of the Kingpin. And it's just like, that's when Spider-Man is his most dangerous, is when, okay, I'm not self-conscious about being schmucky Peter Parker. I have this power, and it's unleashed, and watch out. And I love that moment, and I told Straczynski, I think it's one of the best Spider-Man moments of, yeah, listen, I know I'm the kid and I'm awkward and everything like that. It's like, I'm dangerous. Don't fuck with me. And it's like, yeah, man, that's beautiful, because that's when it's unleashed. It's like, wow, look out, man, because Spider-Man's pissed and he's got the power to take care of things.
Yeah, I love the Straczynski run of Spider-Man, especially the first couple of years. Yes. I think are just some of the best Spider-Man comics ever, and rereading them, like doing this book, I did not have a ton of time to do the whole thing, so you kind of have to pick your battles when it comes to especially rereading,
sure.
Trying to read stuff that I hadn't read before, but then also rereading the stuff that I had to make sure that I really had a good handle on it so I could write about it. And his stuff wasn't all that long ago, and I had a pretty decent memory of it already, but I found myself taking way too much time. I should be reading other stuff, but these are so good that I just wanted to – I kept reading issue after issue of his Spider-Man, and I love all the stuff that he did with Aunt May.
Sure. Yes, the editorial. When she the big reveal. And, oh, my God, that final splash page of her, Peter wiped out asleep in his Spider-Man costume and her walking in. It's the best.
Yeah, so – I guess I'm trying to think. I guess that he did that storyline sort of pretty late in his run. That was with the children of Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy.
Yes,
which they've pretty much kind of ignored since then. Probably for the better, I guess. But I think, barring that, I think his stories hold up really, really well. And maybe for me, what it was reading them now was and and in some ways, the stuff, the Brand New Day and all of that came right after him, maybe it was a reaction to it. But it was his Spider-Man felt more grown up, which as a adult person, human being now, I guess I don't know, maybe I can relate to that Peter Parker a bit more.
Sure.
He's not quite the depressed dad bod Spidey of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but he's probably the closest one that's ever existed in the comics. When that run starts, he and Mary Jane are split up.
Yes.
And, he starts this new job as a high school teacher, which is it's probably impractical for a guy who's constantly running around trying to save the city to have a regular 9-to-5 job, especially one as regimented as being a teacher.
Yep.
As the husband of a teacher. I don't think my wife, if she was Spider-Woman, I think I'd have a pretty good idea. You would know. You couldn't keep that going in secret.
I'm with you.
But nonetheless, it was. I thought that was really kind of clever and interesting role for Peter Parker because, it made a lot of sense to me that character would do that.
Sure.
And just in general, the sort of maturity of those issues, I think, is really cool, and they just read really well. I think the voices he has for all the characters, not just Peter, were really good. And yeah, some of those specific moments you mentioned are wonderful, and they were definitely some of my favorites to reread. Where I loved them when they were coming out. I remember when they first were coming out, and it was whoa, this is a big step up in terms of what's been going on lately in Spider-Man. These are really good, and I thought they held up really, really well rereading them now.
For Brand New Day, and forgive me, I can't help but think of my own feelings about the various runs. The one thing that always really bugged me was they kind of retconned his relationship with Betty Brant. And that really bothered me because all of a sudden Betty Brant was this older woman, and it's like, well, that's not appropriate. He was a kid, and she was older. And it's like, well, no, you guys are like kind of imprinting that on their relationship. I know one of my best friends didn't go to college, went right to the workforce when she was 18. And she's a really smart woman. And it's like, that's not uncommon. And it's like, you guys kind of made this, well, so she's kind of more of a, older sister now. And it's like, no, man, they dated. Calm down. I'm like, it's okay. And it's like, I didn't think it was robbing the cradle as they kind of imprinted on that themselves. And I wondered if there were any other older runs that they might have retconned, or just even runs that you read that you're like, oh, I'm surprised at how much I like this or don't like this, and it might have been a classic run.
Well, I will say, first of all, in terms of what you're saying about Betty Brant, that period, I'm not, I don't want to discount any of your feelings about that, but
That's
there is,
cool.
one issue that
Disagree.
is roughly in that era. I think it's Amazing Spider-Man number 664. It's maybe my favorite, like all-time favorite, like Betty Brant issues, and it's this one where it's sort of in the run-up to that Spider Island storyline.
Yes.
And she is, I think, attacked and hurt.
Yes.
And Spider-Man, Peter, is, intent on basically on finding the person who did it. And so it's getting back to that classic Spider-Man versus Peter dilemma, where is his responsibility to finding the person who did it, or is the responsibility to being there for her in the hospital,
right, as
and
Peter,
friends and all that?
Yes.
So and there's some lovely moments between the two of them in that issue as well. So I all of what you said aside, there is some really cool. Maybe that's a little bit, I guess, after the start of the Brand New Day stuff, but it's sort of in that era. I would include that as part of the same era.
Yes,
and I think that is a nice. If you love Betty Brant, that's like, to me, that especially lately, where she hasn't been a really important character. That's a really.
Oh no, I agree, and I mean, well, that's the thing, man. Because there are old girlfriends that or old relationships where the friendship remains, and you maybe aren't involved intimately anymore, but. You still care about the person deeply, and they know you. And again, I think that's a very adult relationship thing to explore. And I don't mind where Peter and Betty are now. It was, like I said, for me, it was more just wiping out the idea.
Sure.
That's what bothered me. And it's like, no, man, it's like you're cheap. I mean, and especially as an adult reader as well, Matt. I mean, I just feel like we're really in a great period where these stories that were written for 12-year-olds can now be appreciated on a couple levels. And you can really explore adult ideas. And I mean, the readership is there to do it. They are certainly trying to translate that in the television and film properties as well in general with these things. And that's the thing. And I just think a character like Spider-Man, who's had such a long publishing history, it's like there's a lot of great relationships in there. And yeah, they've changed from where they were in the 60s and stuff like that. It's okay. But like I said, don't wipe it out. I mean, again, I don't mean to hammer it, but I'm just like, yeah, that's just kind of, like I said, it's just kind of cheap. It's like, oh, yeah, that's too bad. I mean, they always seem to be able to make continuity work. God, in the case of Grant Morrison and Batman, going back, 70 years or whatever, when he was writing Batman. And it's like, come on. Spider-Man deserves the same kind of thing. I don't know.
Right. Well, yeah, that's he's uniquely good at that sort of thing.
Sure.
In terms of your other question about sort of like what runs that maybe I didn't know or I didn't remember or that really stood out, one that definitely comes to mind where it was right before I really started reading, or a couple of years before I started reading, obsessively. So I'd only kind of had maybe an issue here or two, around just collecting over the years. And then I made a concerted effort to kind of read the whole chunk as part of the research for the book and thought these are really great. Was all the stuff from the first issues with the black costume, the alien costume, when when Peter returns from
the
original Secret Wars with the original, the Venom suit. So it's Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz. I think that's a really underrated run of issues that you don't hear mentioned too often alongside like the great runs with, of course, the early stuff by Stanley and Steve Ditko and Romita, and then Roger Stern and Conway and Roger Stern and
Stern
and all the people
Stern
we've already
amazing.
talked about.
Yeah,
for sure. And they're all great. Like they're justifiably, beloved. But I feel like this is one that, for whatever reason, I honestly don't even know why. Like there's some really, really good stuff in there. I think the Peter Parker in there is really good. There's a lot of like really consequential stuff going on in those issues if you care about that sort of thing, because there's all the Michigas with the costume, but then there's also that's also the period where like Mary Jane becomes kind of the Mary Jane she really kind of evolved into, where it wasn't just this kind of party girl character. They really kind of reconceived her as the version that basically is like she's always presented as now in like every medium, where she has, she comes from this very, broken and sometimes even abusive home, and that, that a lot of how she was portrayed previously is like this kind of false surface that she created, almost like Peter Parker creating Spider-Man in a way.
Yes,
that she has her own secret identity, essentially.
Yep.
And there's a great issue where she kind of pours her heart out to Peter after she reveals that she's known for however long that he's really Spider-Man. And that's a great issue. And so, I feel like that's definitely a run that if you haven't read those comics, and you have like the Marvel Unlimited app, where you can just go and read every single Amazing Spider-Man ever for the monthly price. And they're not paying me to say this, I promise you. This is just, this is not a paid plug. Like, that's a good run to, like, check out. If you have not read those and you're a Spider-Man fan, just start with, like, you can start with the first one where with the black costume. That's a perfect kind of jumping on point. And there's, like, a good 2 years, I think, at least, of good stuff in there. That's definitely worth checking out. And there's others we could go through, but that was one of the ones that, for me, reading for the book for research, I was like, these, like, that I had never even really read before, all the way through, that I was like, these are kind of undiscovered gems in a lot of ways.
That's excellent, man. No, I remember the period, and I think that's great. I got to be honest. I mean, I appreciated Venom when it was introduced, and I've had this conversation with David Michelini, as I'm sure you have as well, for the book. Not a big Venom fan, got to be honest, because I really, again, much like the Clone Saga, it's like, okay, I think Venom was a very dangerous and interesting adversary for Peter. When they turned him into an anti-hero, and really, no offense to Donny Cates fans and Stegman fans, because I know they've been doing it, especially recently, a hell of a job with Venom, and I admire them both as creators. That character just, to me, was just like, okay, too much. And God, when I remember, because this is kind of the period where I checked out, and I saw a brown-looking Venom, and I'm like, oh, why did Venom change from black to brown? Oh, no, that's Carnage. Who the fuck is Carnage? Well, Eddie Brock is evil, but, man, I'll tell you, Cletus is really evil. And I'm like, fuck you. Good Lord. I'm sorry. And again, the filter's off as far as I'm concerned in talking about it. But I'm like, too much fucking Venom. Good Lord. And then Carnage even more so. I'm like, all right, what are you guys doing? So I'm not a Venom or Carnage fan. Again, appreciated the idea of Venom as an adversary of Spider-Man, but didn't need him to be the star of his own book. But that's just me.
Sure. I mean, again, no. I think it's the same. It's basically the same kind of problem that what's the word I'm looking for? That kind of sunk the Clone Saga.
Yeah.
It's like Venom was maybe the ultimate victim of his own success, and that he was this very interesting character, very dynamic visually. Just between McFarlane and Eric Larson as the two guys who really kind of defined what he looked like. Like, those issues, the art in those issues is so dynamic,
absolutely,
and energetic.
No, where you think it's Spider-Man, and all of a sudden you realize it's Eddie, and it's the symbiote and everything, and No, it got very horrific in the best ways. Absolutely, initially. Absolutely.
Right. And, I mean, Venom is pretty close to the start of McFarlane's run.
Right.
And so it's like as he's getting kind of settled in, like you can if you just look at, which I did doing, for the book, like if you look at Amazing Spider-Man just a couple of issues before McFarlane comes on, and then you compare it to what it looks like once he's on the book, it's like a shot in the arm.
100%.
Like the energy, the dynamism, the excitement that he brought just through the artwork. Like I don't think you can kind of understate the impact that he had on Spider-Man, the look of the character,
Mary Jane,
the look of his books, Mary Jane, panel layouts, the way that there's like a before and after in terms of Spider-Man's webbing.
Absolutely.
When it comes to
oh my God! Yes, the spaghetti-looking webbing as opposed to the ropey-looking classic webbing. Absolutely, my God.
And I think that like Venom is almost like this expression of that energy.
Yes.
Like he's just like just like in your face Spider-Man, where he's like even bigger. He's got crazy teeth. He's got fangs. It's dripping goo. Like he's just like that. He's like the personification of that energy in some ways.
Totally
and
agree.
I feel like that he was a really perfect foil for Spider-Man in a lot of ways. I've never been as big a fan of him as like you, as like an anti-hero. I kind of enjoyed. I think his earlier appearances were more interesting. But again, like I said, I feel like he became so popular. They put him in a book, and the book sold. So what do? They give him his own book, and you can't have him like eating people's heads and eating brains. Like all those early appearances, he's talking about eating people's brains.
Yes.
Like. These are, again, if these are books for ostensibly, children and teenagers, especially back in 1990, whatever it was, you probably can't have the main character doing so much brain eating, or at least threatening to brain eat. So what do? Well, you make him an anti-hero and make him, which is certainly was in the zeitgeist at the time, right? I mean, there's a lot of characters that were introduced around then that were, there was a kind of that was a movement within I probably not just comics, but wider popular culture where, I mean, there's so many examples in the 90s of like the most popular characters were anti-heroes, from
that was the period.
The Terminator and Terminator 2 to Stone Cold Steve Austin, like that was the decade of anti-heroes.
Absolutely.
So Venom is a perfect example of that. So, yeah, it's not my favorite villain. He's not my favorite, especially when he becomes the star of the show. But I think in small doses, he's a pretty great.
I agree.
He's a pretty good bad guy, and visually, he's certainly one of the best bad guys. Just the design and the way that they turned that black suit into this like evil, mirror image of Spider-Man is a pretty good foil for the character.
Totally agree, man. And again, like you said, from an art standpoint, really opened up the book in a lot of great ways. It was just, too much pizza. You can't have pizza every day, and they just kind of, shoved Venom down our throats.
He's the meat lover's pizza of Spider-Man villain. But if you had to eat it every day for a year or something.
Very good, man. Look, I know I had told you we were going to talk for an hour. Should we hold off and talk about other things in a separate conversation? Because I am always curious about what you think about what's going on. I mean, I don't want to monopolize your time if you got other things to do. It's up to you. Do you? I was going to ask you about. I mean, certainly, if very briefly, the classic movie makers are kind of shitting on Marvel lately. And I understand and I respect them still. They are masters of film. It is, to me, a little disappointing that they kind of forgot where they came from, given that, Scorsese and Coppola in particular were working on Roger Corman's schlock and a lot of genre fiction in their own histories before they were really given the opportunity to broaden their horizons cinematically. And, it's nothing new for Coppola. Coppola's been saying it for years. But yeah, I am disappointed that they don't see the technical innovations that are happening in the superhero films as something new and interesting and something they would have likely leaned on if those technologies existed 50 years ago or 60 years ago when they were starting their film careers, and that they really, and also that they're not paying attention to some good character moments. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on? I mean, I'm sure you're thinking about this stuff as you're seeing the quotes in the paper that these guys are making.
Yeah, I love all of these. Not all of, but I love the vast majority of these movies that we're talking about. So to me, it's like I don't agree with them, but I also, it's their opinions. I feel like if it's not their thing, I would definitely never want like Martin Scorsese to make Dark Hawk if that's his cup of tea. And so, if it's not his thing, that's cool. He doesn't. I don't feel like if he says, well, they're not interesting to me, or they're not my thing, or whatever his exact quote was, it doesn't affect my love of those things in one little bit, and it doesn't affect my love of Martin Scorsese movies either. Like,
of course not.
That's totally fine. I think to some degree, it's like I'm like desperately waiting for people to stop asking old filmmakers like what they think of Marvel, because every time they do, they say something that really upsets people, and then there's like another 2 weeks of outraged articles about it, and to me, it's just a little exhausting. Well, that said, I mean, the new Martin Scorsese movie, The Irishman,
I'm psyched as hell.
Is largely done with de-aging technology that through visual effects, digital effects, where the main actors are all presented for parts of the movie as younger as they are.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. That's funny.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure the first place that I saw that done really well is in Marvel movies, is in like Civil War with young Robert Downey Jr. and in Captain Marvel, where Samuel L. Jackson was playing himself like 20 years younger in that whole movie, and the effect was seamless. Like the first place, others have done it, but I feel like the place that has really made those effects look really good and very convincing were in Marvel movies. So while I 100% support Martin Scorsese saying and doing whatever the heck he feels like, I do think that there is, like you said, there's some innovative stuff going on in those movies as well. I just don't think it's a big deal if Brian De Palma wants to come out and say like, I don't like these movies. Like, that's okay, Brian De Palma. I still love you. It's not a big deal to me. Like, I'm not. I don't need their affirmation of what I love. I love what I love, no matter what these people say.
I get that, but again, the point I keep making on social media about this stuff, and I want to know what you think, is your target is your wrong target. Don't blame Marvel for this. Blame the other studios, or blame what's going on in cinema in general, in that the mid-budget film no longer fits in the theaters. That's not what people are going to movie theaters to see. They are finding complicated stories on television, and the movies, the things that would have been the summer blockbusters or the movies we're talking about in any given season, there are fewer of those, and that product is finding its way to streaming. And I mean, Jodie Foster, Jennifer Aniston, you can name actors that have made these same arguments as well. And it's like, what you're looking for still exists. It's just happening on television now. And I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it's like, don't blame Marvel for that. I mean, really, again, it's like the studios are deciding these aren't cost-effective movies anymore, but television's very happy to take these stories and ideas. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. I would completely agree with you. Like there is sort of this kind of paradigm shift that's still like we're in the middle of right now, and a big part of it is that yes, like the movies that are working in theaters for now are really these spectacles and these huge events. And I don't not for nothing, but if you know your Hollywood history, like the era when Scorsese and Coppola kind of came up, like their era, the new Hollywood era, when they were making these funky, kind of experimental, very adult, cutting edge movies, only existed for a couple of years before it was basically swamped out by the Marvel movies of that era, which was the first blockbuster era with Jaws and the first Star Wars and Close Encounters and Superman and on it. Right, exactly.
Yep.
So to some extent, this is a bit of history repeating itself, and maybe that's some lingering feelings about that has something to do with this. I don't know. I haven't asked them, and I wouldn't ask them, and I haven't read if they've talked about it. I haven't read them talking about it, but I that might be part of it. And like you said, that this is kind of this time that we're in, where a lot of the movies where that these men would have made 20, 30, 40 years ago, they're not being made anymore. Or if they're being made for Netflix. I mean, the Irishman, the movie I just mentioned a few minutes ago, like Martin Scorsese's new movie, which I'm sure Netflix paid a boatload of money for, that's a Netflix movie. And it is going to play in some limited releases. But for the most part, the vast majority of people who watch that movie are going to watch it at home, or God forbid, on their tablets on an airplane on Netflix. Yep. So, to some extent, there is if they're saying things like, well, that's not cinema or whatever they said, I think it's more like what the definition of what that is changing. And the place, the home for those kinds of different stories, or the Scorsese and Coppola and et al. Kinds of stories. You're right. I think a lot of them are relocating to either television or kind of the nebulous area of streaming, where they're kind of both films and television exist now. But there's a lot of long form storytelling and a lot of more creative experimentation is being done there, and risks are being taken there as well.
I hear you, man, and that's just kind of my feeling. And again, they're not going to say that, hey, we're mad at the studios, because they still want to do business with the studios. So I just kind of feel like it's convenient that they can just go, it's Marvel. Fuck Marvel. God damn it. They suck. And it's like, well, Jesus, man. I don't know. Like I said, it's like the game's changed, for better or for worse, and until the fad fades, this is the status quo, and do the best you can. And again, go to the platforms where they're very happy to be in business with you. And obviously, I don't think it's I don't think it's a problem they have to contend with. Maybe Coppola does. Coppola always has problems with some of his passion projects as he's getting older. Scorsese certainly has a better track record of success that I think people are still willing to do it. But I also think that also these streaming things, from a prestige standpoint, would be very happy to be in the Coppola business. So I don't know. Anyway, Joker, thoughts?
I was not the biggest Joker fan
That's cool.
in the world.
Neither was I.
To be honest with you. To me, I love Joaquin Phoenix. And I don't know, it just felt to me like kind of a watered-down version of other movies I've seen him do.
100%, yes.
Like You Were Never Really Here, or The Master.
Sure.
Or, it's that kind of loner, mentally damaged kind of character he's done several times before in just more interesting movies. And it is kind of funny, the Scorsese thing. Like,
yes.
After talking for 5-10 minutes about, Martin Scorsese is not a huge fan of these movies, or at least Marvel movies, and here is this Joker movie that literally in this form, it could not exist without Martin Scorsese, because it is just wholesale taking huge chunks of Taxi Driver and King of Comedy and kind of smushing them together in a new movie. It's pretty interesting that while that's all going on, while all this kind of controversy about what Scorsese said is going on, like, the biggest movie in the world is this superhero movie that's just shamelessly inspired by his movies, I think is very kind of surreal.
Yeah, and I wondered on the bigger picture, Matt, what you think of, because seeing Ad Astra and its nods to Kubrick in 2001, and also Todd Phillips in the Joker movie, but even going back a couple of years, and it's David O. Russell or American Hustle, who made American Hustle?
David O. Russell.
It was David O. Russell. Okay. Isn't it interesting that there's a handful of filmmakers that are really going beyond an homage to classic films, but are really, I refer to Joker as a cover band doing a song, and you're not aware of the original and going, oh my God, this is amazing. And it's like, yeah, you should have seen it when the Beatles did it. Because, it's
right.
And that's the thing, and that's nothing new for Hollywood. Good Lord, Ben-Hur went from the silence to, just a couple of years ago, the bomb of the remake of Ben-Hur, the third time they tried to do it. So it's nothing new for Hollywood, but I do find it interesting that there are several filmmakers out there that are really hitting kind of a remix of some classic other filmmakers. And again, you can point to the burnt out, Uncle Owen's farm in Star Wars being lifted right from the Searchers, and certainly Tarantino, will take several different movies and mash them up in his movies and stuff, and there are clear homages for people who know their film history. But it really seems like in these recent cases of Ad Astra and Joker, and like I said, David O. Russell, even with American Hustle, it's like, wow, man, you're really like hitting it hard and like giving us, kind of a poor man's Scorsese for an obvious comparison.
Yeah, the thing about, with Joker too, in terms of this, that idea of homage or just straight up copying, if you're feeling less charitable, was, it wasn't just that it borrowed from those movies. Like you mentioned a bunch of movies that I like that, often take elements from different movies.
Yes.
Elements. Like, almost every single Quentin Tarantino movie is inspired 100%. By a whole jumble of different things. I think the difference for me was where, those movies, they still feel like something new made out of something old, where, just in my opinion, like, I didn't find a lot of newness in Joker.
Agreed.
I just found a lot of, it was like rehashing a lot of the plots of those movies, but not. I don't know. It didn't feel like it captured the soul of those movies.
Totally agree.
What Scorsese was, kind of trying to get at with those movies, besides just showing this, these figures of discontent and anger and rage, like. It's like, and then what? It's like, okay, this person is very angry, but what do I leave the theater with,
sure,
besides just having watched them be angry and miserable? And I didn't really feel like I came away from Joker feeling much more than that. Whereas those other movies that it's kind of inspired by, it felt like there was a lot more going on. Other people disagree with us, but that was how I felt.
And honestly, it's the combination for me for Joker. I've read too many Batman Joker stories, so I have preconceived notions of how the character is. And again, this is my feelings on it, and I've discussed it. I can't help it. And this, by the way, shows me that it's still on my mind. So there's something there that I still want to talk about, and it's a provocative movie. But I do think that there are a couple generations of filmgoers that, don't dive into film history, have never seen King of Comedy and Taxi Driver. So for them, it is brand new. And I get that. And that's fine. You're only, responsible for the things that you experience. And if you've never seen these things before, you can be made aware of them. I don't know how many people are going to go run off and watch King of Comedy and Taxi Driver. It's a shame if they don't. Especially, I think, in the case of King of Comedy, which I think did say a bunch of fresh things. And like a good movie, I think has changed just because of the way society has changed around it. And I really think the ending of King of Comedy is very... it's a different ending than I think what Scorsese intended originally, my own personal feeling on it. But that's the thing. So I think they're not at fault for not knowing these older movies and stuff like that. And then really, I guess Phillips, at the end of the day, it's a big departure from The Hangover. So I'm very conflicted. There are things I appreciate, and I think Phillips did a good job, but I also, like you said, there are just story choices and the blatant ripoffs, not homages. These are, and I wonder almost if Scorsese's producer credit is because it's almost obligatory because of how much it leans on those movies like Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. I don't know.
Yeah, was he actually credited? I know at one point he was involved in the film, and then I thought he maybe dropped out, which I thought was interesting. But I'm not
maybe
100%.
Yeah, I'm not either, and shame on me.
I don't think he's credited on the final film. But you're right that he was at one point. It was announced that he was going to be like a producer.
Oh yeah.
But I think at a certain point he distanced himself from the film, which is kind of interesting given the way it turned out
and the current quotes,
and the current quotes and all the things that you were saying about it. I think that's pretty interesting as well.
I'll tell you, Matt, because honestly, I know we're going past what I told you in terms of an hour. I don't know if you're busy, but maybe we should plan on talking at the end of the year. And I've famous last words in some of our conversations, and then suddenly it's 5 years later. But no, honestly, I wouldn't mind after the fall or the rise of Skywalker. Oh, that's almost a Freudian slip. I'm not a hater. I am when it comes to Star Trek Discovery. I won't deny that. I am not a Star Wars hater. But this has been a very interesting year, and also with the wrap up of Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that it might be fun to kind of look at all the nerd movies and see where things are going, and some of the nerd television as well. Because I wanted to obviously talk about Spider-Man, promote the book, which again I think is a fantastic art book, very worthy of your attention. So yeah, I don't know if you have time, like I said, at the end of the year, should we reconvene? And
yeah, let's do it. That sounds like a great idea.
All right. Well, in the meantime, it's out now. It's called Spider-Man: From Amazing to Spectacular, the definitive comic art collection, and it's from Matt Singer. And congratulations, man! No, I am for a first book. It's a hell of a book. I'm proud of you for being able to do it, and I hope this is the beginning of others. I have always appreciated your opinions on Screen Crush and some of your former IndieWire and some of your other IFC. Some of the other places that you've written criticism and been a part of. So, yeah, as always, keep up the great work, and I'm glad you're out there still calling them like you see them.
Thank you. It was great. It was great talking to you again, and yeah, let's do a little end of the year wrap up in a couple of months.
There you go. Great talk with Matt Singer. I'm sure we'll be checking in later this year with another review of things that are coming up. I mean, it's a full slate of, Birds of Prey and the Black Widow movie and so many other geek-related films coming. Bloodshot, Vin Diesel. Jeez, I'll tell you. So it's going to be a very exciting 2020, and I certainly want to hear Matt's point of view. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. It was brought to you by Aftershock Comics. Aftershock getting things going in 2020 with some brand new titles to look forward to. In February, it's John Layman's The Man Who Effed Up Time. There's also God Killers by Mark Sable, and also Zach Thompson's Undone by Blood. So look for those to go along with other great books like Dark Arc from Cullen Bunn and Juan Doe, Dark Red from Tim Seeley, also great books from Marguerite Bennett like Animosity, and wonderful Garth Ennis books like A Walk Through Hell, and of course Baby Teeth with Donnie Cates, among other great Aftershock titles. Go to their website, you'll find full preview pages, full story descriptions, and the diamond codes how to order these books through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Thanks again for listening. More great conversation for you in the month of January. I was off to a slow start. Sorry about that, but picking things up hard with some great new conversations with returning guests and brand new people as well. I think you're going to enjoy this month of January right here on Word Balloon. Until next time, thanks a lot for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2020.